And the slides, actually, Tiffany, can you drop the link to the slides if they want to follow along? Do you mind?
Yes.
Thanks. Okay, so today I want to talk about something that is really interesting to me. I teach art history at my face-to-face school. And as we're wrapping up the year, we're trying to pay attention to these big concepts. And I think that's where art history becomes pretty accessible for just about anybody. I'm hoping that when you leave here tonight, you've got a better understanding about not just what's happened, but what is happening now in the art world and how you can maybe feel a little bit more engaged with it. But I want to start by just talking about, here's our overview. We're going to talk about what culture is first, because that's a big part of what I'm going to talk about tonight. And then I'm going to introduce the concept of aesthetics. Like in art, that's the language that artists use. It's, those principles and elements of design. We'll talk about some examples, and I'll show you some from global prehistory to global contemporary art. And we'll wrap up by thinking about, are artists conscious of the decisions they make regarding how their culture influences their art making, and we'll get a little bit of practice in. So before we begin, is there anybody else who has some connection with art that wants to share anything about how much you might know? Let me try it like this. Is there one piece of art that's you think is of famous, or one famous artist whose name you remember? I'll start you off. Okay, I'm gonna put it in the chat. I bet that when I write this, you'll say, oh yes, I have heard of that one. Is that pretty safe bet? Everybody heard of Van Gogh? Okay. Can you think of anybody else that you've heard of? I got another one for you. How about that one? I'm guessing that's a pretty safe bet too. There are some names that we have heard about from a lot of different reasons, but some of these artists that we're going to talk about today don't come from what we call the Western tradition of art. And that's the other thing I want to explore, is when we're talking about culture and art, it only makes sense if we talk about that in terms of different cultures too. So maybe by the time you leave here today, you'll have some favorites that you aren't familiar with. And I tried to include the name of the artist or the culture if the artist isn't known from which the pieces come. So these are the terms that I'm going to use. I know that if you've taken an art class before, you've probably heard, line, shape, texture, color. That's definitely part of the vocabulary that we use when we talk about art. But when we talk about things that shape which of those you choose, I want to focus on these four. I like to think about it like you're baking a recipe, right? So you have tons of ingredients you could use, but when you decide what you need to make, you use that recipe and it'll tell you specifically how much of those ingredients. So when we talk about the ingredients in art, we're talking about line, shape, color, texture, but which of those things becomes the focus depends on these four things. These are like the recipes. They're actually maybe more like the occasions for why you're baking. So let's practice really quick. Pretend you're a baker and somebody calls you up and they say, hey, baker, I want a cake. What would you need to know in order to make a cake for this person? Put something in the chat or unmute if you'd like to and tell me what's something you would want to know if you were baking a cake for somebody. Oh, well, if you call a baker, yeah, I was thinking the flavor, right? What kind of cake do you want? Okay, so let's say that the customer that's calling you says, I want a chocolate cake. What else do you need to know about it? I mean, you can make a chocolate cake, but there are other things to consider too, right? Like what else? What else would you want to know? Yeah, like what do you want on the top of the cake? What else do you know about cakes? Jonathan, exactly right. Size. Like, do they want, and what shape too, right? Do they need like a long sheet cake or do they want layers? We got the flavor of the cake. We got toppings on the cake. Is there anything else you would want to know? What might you do with this cake once you got it in the oven? You're baking the cake. You know what size it is. You know what flavor the cake is. There's one really, really key ingredient that we're missing. What's the best part of the cake? Well, at least it's my favorite part. What kind of frosting do you want on it? And they might say, I want chocolate frosting on it, but then you get to go, well, do you want, buttercream frosting? Do you want cream cheese? That all kinds of choices come up. And that analogy that we're talking about with cakes is a lot like what we can talk about with art. If somebody says, I'm going to make art, it's a lot like saying, I need a cake, because you have to think about, why are you making art? What do you want to make the cake for? Is there a special occasion? Well, artists might have a special reason for making a piece of artwork. What's the purpose? How is it going to look? How big is it going to be? All of these things, if I tell you all those things are part of making art, you probably agree. But what if I told you that I think all of those things are also decided by culture? That's what I'm going to try and demonstrate today. Okay, so we'll talk about form, function, content, and context. And I like to call those different orders, but sometimes I call them FCCF, just to remember it. And those are the four things you want to think about when you're talking about what choices artists make, the same way we talk about what choices bakers make. So I want to drop this for you. Let me see. Whoops. If I can get out of here, and I'm going to drop this link in the chat for you, because you're going to need to make a copy to do this first step on your own. All right. Somebody tell me when you click on that link, it should tell you to make a copy, but then you have one that you can edit. I just want to make sure it works for you. Can somebody tell me when they've got their copy made? When you say yes, it should look like this. So I'm going to give everybody a minute to make a copy of their, it's just a practice so that we can all do it together. So when you have your copy opened up, put a yes in the chat. I see a couple of icons on it. Oh, great. Thank you. All right, super. So what we're going to do, and we'll go through this together. I'm going to edit this copy that's on the slides, but I want you to do your own. So thank you for that feedback. When I go on with this, I can teach you about, art terms or aesthetic terms, but I want to know what you think about when I say these two words, identity and culture. So just take 1 minute to write down some words or ideas that you think of when you think about identity. And then we'll do the same thing for the second box, culture. Okay, so just think about it carefully. It's not a right or wrong thing. This is just our brainstorming before we get started. I'm not sure if it's easy to do, but any right answer, counts. Any answer is right. That's what I mean to say. So I'm going to start off my copy. Let's see. What does identity mean? Well, if somebody asks me for my identity, I'm gonna say that. Did anybody put name down? I think your name is part of your identity, right? When you have an identification card, that's one of the things on there. What else do you think would tell people more about your identity? Can you think of anything else? What's something you put on yours? We got a name. How about, oh, I've got one. Did you think about that one? Ooh, background. Yeah, definitely. I think that's part of your background. I think, if I'm understanding you right, deals with like your past experiences. So stuff that's happened to you, definitely. Where you live, your date of birth. Absolutely right. You can't change that even if you wanted to. I think that's part of your identity for the rest of your life. Great. Family, definitely. Maybe let's get one more. Oh, I've got one. I kind of mentioned it before. When we were talking about background, it made me think about not just your experiences, but this one. Did anybody put down identity, like things that you do, like your hobbies or your work or your school or your classes? I know that when some of y'all came in earlier to the meet, you know, I said, what kind of classes are you taking? Because that was part of how I understood your identity. All right, y'all are good at this. So let's go ahead and jump over to culture. Now, there may be some overlap, and that's okay. But we're just trying to get like a basis for our understanding. What are some things that you think about when you hear the word culture? Okay, beliefs. And maybe something more specific in beliefs. Tradition, great. So yeah, I'm going to make it plural because there can be more than one. Traditions that you have. What other things define culture? I don't know if you've thought about, you know, this, but do locations have culture? You know, just like where you live, is there a culture in your neighborhood? Do you think that North Carolina has a culture? And even bigger than that, does America have a culture that's different from other places? What do you think? Is that part of it too? Absolutely. You know, I had a teacher one time in college who was, he taught anthropology, and he told our class, he didn't really feel like you could understand a culture unless you knew their language. Like you can know there's a culture there, but until you understand the ways they communicate, you definitely don't know their culture. In fact, I'll go one further and say, you know, just communication, because we can also communicate in ways that are maybe beyond language, nonverbal, right? Ooh, customs. Absolutely. Now, what I want to point out so far, you guys did awesome at this, is that we didn't say anything directly about art, and that's okay, because I'm going to show you again that this kind of stuff intersects with art making. But before we leave this slide, is there anything else you want to add on either identity or culture that you didn't get a chance to tell me about? Okay. Well, okay, I got a question. We have beliefs, but does education have a role in culture? Do you think different cultures think differently about education? Is that fair? I'm going to add it up there. I think we've got a good list here. So hopefully you have yours in front of you, because we're going to need this. We're going to come back to this, but I'm going to go on to the next slide. You also have a second slide in your set. And this is for you to create a sort of art that reflects your own identity and culture. Okay, so let me explain. You are going to try and take images, and you can just use Google Images. Anything on the web is fine. You're not going to share this with anybody. It's totally private. But I want you to start taking the ideas that you have and turning them into something visual. All right. I'm going to start mine, and you want to follow the same pattern, you can, but take the things that you looked at here and try to think about specifically those things related to you. So this collage you're going to make is just about you. So for example, I'm going to go to insert image and search the web. That's one way we can do this. All right. And I got to slide this over here. All right. I'm going to search for dogs because I have 2 dogs that are definitely part of my family. They don't look anything like these dogs though. But there's a picture of 2 dogs. So for the sake of time, I'm just going to say, yeah, that's what I want. And I'm going to shrink it down a little bit because my dogs are, one's dark and one's lighter. And I'm going to include the dogs, but they're not a huge part of my identity, but they are definitely part of it. So I'll make that picture really small. We said family. So like in my family, I have 2 kids. My mom, she lives with us. We're really close. And my husband. So I might want to put a picture of just people to represent my family. I'm going to do the same search. See, I'm going to put kids. All right. That's 3 kids. And I just got 2. I'm going to pick those 2. Insert. All right. Now, the other thing we said that was important to identity and culture is what we do. I like to run. I like to read. And I am a teacher. So instead of going through Google Images, I'm going to try a different route. I'm going to put, let's see, go this way and put running. I'll put runner. I'm going to pick an image. No, that's not the runner that I meant. Okay. I'm training for a race actually in May. So definitely going to use a runner in my collage. All right. So I think you're getting the idea here. I'm going to work for another minute on mine, and I want you to work for another minute on yours, okay? But just 1 more minute. I like cooking too. That's one of my hobbies, and it's also one of my main jobs in the house. Anybody else want to put cooking on theirs too? And I said reading. Okay. These are pretty easy ones to find pictures of. And maybe it's not the greatest collage, but there we go. Try to get at least 5 pictures that are visual representations of the things that are part of your identity and culture. I didn't really address culture very much yet, so let me think about a cultural belief. My neighborhood is pretty tight, so I'm going to put community down because that's part of a belief. That's part of my culture, is having people around and interacting with them. All right. Hey, do you think music is a part of culture too? Maybe you have something there that represents you. And if you finish your collage, you don't have to write something down, but you might just think about it. Think about the things that you say are part of your culture and your identity. And that's going to be the basis for what we talk about next. Okay. Slide on over here and jump right into our content. So when we talk about identity and culture, what we can see is that is sometimes very personal. Your identity is sometimes very personal, but it's influenced by your culture. I mean, I wouldn't say that my family is my culture, but we do have, you know, customs and traditions that we follow. We have certain ways that we celebrate birthdays in my house. In my community, we have certain events that we do every year that the whole neighborhood is a part of. And I could put something about my school here as part of my culture too, because the things that I do as a teacher and what I do with other teachers is part of my culture. So when I did this collage, what I did is I made art about my identity and culture, but I was trying to illustrate it. And what I think happens sometimes by professional artists is when they make art, they don't necessarily think about showing you who they are. They might be thinking about something else. And they might not tell you directly what their beliefs are, but you can see it in their choices. Okay, so let me illustrate what I mean. One of the first things that we're going to look at in terms of art is the most obvious one. What is the content? What's the subject matter of a piece of art? And the culture and identity will definitely influence what the subject matter is. I don't know if you know these words that are on the slide. Do you recognize these words, or, you know, do they mean something to you? I have iconic, aniconic, figurative, and abstracted. They may not, and that's okay. But what they represent is how culture would, you know, inform an artist's work. So iconic means it has like people in it, icons. Aniconic means no people are there at all. They're not allowed. And I'll show you an example. Figurative and abstracted are also, do you try and make a picture that looks just like something, or do you change it? And that's a cultural decision too. So let me show you some examples. Here is a picture of the Dome of the Rock. And in this picture, it's a sacred site, but what you notice about the outside of the building is it's highly decorated, right? But there's no people on it. In fact, it has calligraphy. Those are verses from the Quran. And it has a lot of beautiful colors and designs. And these are all glass tiles that cover the outside of the building. In most of Islamic art, it's aniconic. They believe that figurative images are a distraction. On the right-hand side of the screen, you see a picture that's from a Christian tradition. And they actually used, in most of Christian art history, they used people in their art because they were trying to illustrate, you know, stories for people who were not able to read. And so they wanted to tell a story through their art. And that's how culture might impact subject matter. The subject matter might be religious verses, or it might be people, but it's based on your culture too. Here's another example. Context. Context is maybe the biggest factor that influences art choices. It's part of culture too, because it's tied to where you are, when you're alive, what's going on in the world around you, what's your economic status, what's your individual orientation. All that is context. Let me show you how that influences art making. These three pictures, they all look really different, don't they? Do you have a favorite one here of these three? I'm going to be surprised if anybody picks one of these. I'll tell you why. Pick one. I'll call them numbers 1, 2, and 3. Which one do you like the best? well, sorry, I went back. Let me go back here. Which one of these do you like the best? 1 on the far left, 2 in the middle, or 3 on the right? Do you have a favorite? Really? Oh my gosh, that was the one I didn't think anybody would pick. That's funny. Okay, cool. I definitely have a favorite too. It's number 3. That one actually is in the North Carolina Museum of Art. But the reason why I chose all of these is because they all are about the same subject matter, but they're all done in different ways because of the time period when they were made. Okay, let me explain. Actually, hold on, let me let my dog out. Woo, sorry about that. That's the price of working from home. Okay. The first one that some of you liked is actually a photograph, and it's by a photographer named Cindy Sherman. And she is dressed up in a costume, and she had somebody else take the photo, but she posed for it. That was done in 1990. The one in the middle that nobody said they liked the best is done just after the Renaissance. It's in what's called the Baroque period of art. And that's done by a woman named Artemisia Gentileschi. And then the one on the far right that I love the best was from 2012 by the artist Kehinde Wiley. And he is, you might recognize his style a little bit. He's the one that painted the portrait of the Obamas. It's in the National Gallery. All 3 of these are dealing with the same story. And that's why they're an interesting comparison. This is a story from the Bible, the Christian Bible, and it's about a woman. It's in the Old Testament, a woman who killed a person that was threatening her, her community. And in this one on the far right and this one on the far left, you see the head of the person that she's holding. Doesn't really look like it's that gory, but the one in the middle is definitely really much more gory. And the reason why I say context is why these are different, because that one that is right there in the middle is trying to illustrate a dramatic moment. Now, there were definitely people who could read the Bible at this time, but there weren't a lot of women who were painters at this time. And Artemisia Gentileschi was really trying to make a dramatic scene to get people's attention, to get noticed. That's why the lighting is so dramatic. Notice it's like these figures coming out of the dark. It's all about presenting a performance for the viewer. I think presenting a performance is important to Cindy Sherman too, almost 400 years later, but she's definitely doing something. If you look at her face, she looks pretty bewildered or maybe even a little confused. She's kind of making fun of the seriousness of this moment. And she clearly is holding up like a dummy head. It doesn't even look realistic. And then the one on the far right, I think the reason this one is so cool is Kehinde Wiley has a tradition of taking famous paintings and redoing them so that they include people of color as the models. Because that's definitely something that's missing from these first 2, right? When we talk about having people of color represented in art, that's something that unfortunately is a pretty new concept. And that's where context comes into this, right? And I think it's really just fascinating to think about how if these people were living in different times, in different places, they might be painting in different ways. All right, one of the next components is form. And form simply means what's the shape that the art is going to take. So like the materials people use, but also the technology they have available is a big part of that, right? Sometimes we think about how pieces can be shown. There are plenty of pieces in art history that are permanent fixtures. At the very bottom of this slide, you can see the lamasis, or the plural, lamasu. And these sculptures are meant to represent the power of a king who is long dead. So they were once in front of a gate, and they were moved to a museum, but their form was meant to make it really not easy to move them. They were supposed to be permanent. Whereas if you look on the left-hand side and you see this gorgeous painting, that was meant to be shown. It was part of a book that people could, carry around with them and show to other people. And so that was from the Book of Kings. Even though it's a gorgeous painting in itself, it was actually an illustration to a story. And then up at the very top, usually people hate this piece. I love it. It's called Object, but I usually refer to it as furry cup. And that's exactly what it is. It's a coffee cup that's covered in fur, gazelle fur specifically. Now, what does that have to do with culture? Obviously, the culture that's depicted by the lamasis was pretty centered on the king, because it's got his face on this creature. And I think also in this painting on the left, power is important too. It's actually in honor of a king. That's why I say it's from the Book of Kings. But the form of the other piece is actually really not that expensive, and it's definitely portable, and it's meant to highlight this idea that reality isn't always what we think it is. It's supposed to shock us and surprise us. And that's how culture in the 20th century, impacts art making, because we see a lot of art in the 20th century that's just there to surprise us. So what are some other examples of how form impacts photography? Before photography was mainstreamed, you see this drawing in the top right of what's called the steerage. And that was the area under the boat where people who had the least amount of money would be able to afford passage on a boat. And especially if they were coming from Europe to America as immigrants, they would be put in the steerage compartment. If you look at the left-hand side, you see Alfred Stieglitz's photograph called The Steerage. And the reason why I say culture is pretty important to that is because he's showing us something about culture. What do you notice about the people in that photograph that's on the far left? Can you identify any description of them? It's definitely two different groups, right? What does that say about culture? Notice the clothing that the people have on. At the bottom, they're definitely, yes, exactly right. They're divided. So he's using art to show his society. He's telling us something about the people that are wealthier, who can afford to be on the upper decks of the ship. They're dressed more nicely. They all have hats and coats on, and the people below, they've got their laundry hanging up. They've got their kids with them. They're wearing just different layers to try to stay warm. We can tell they're of a different economic class. And then the last thing I have to point out is this one that was done pretty recently. It's an artist, Vic Muniz, who did a imitation of this, photograph 100 years later. And here's why it's cool. Guess what it's made out of? Speaking of form, chocolate syrup. That's right. I don't know if you can see this one in the middle where there's a sort of shine, a reflection on it. That's because it's made out of chocolate syrup. And he did this whole reproduction of this photograph, and then it's gone. But that's another part of culture too, because in our world today, we're kind of used to things being disposable. And that's not the world that these other two artists existed in. Okay, now we've talked about content, context, and function, form. Let's talk about the last one, which is function. Did you ever think about what art is supposed to do? Why do we have art? Why does anybody want to make it? And why does anybody want to own it? That's what I mean when I say the function of art. So if you were given, surprise, you won the lottery, $1 million, would you think about buying artwork with it? I have to agree. I don't know if it would be the first thing that would come to my mind, right? But art does definitely entertain and inform. And so culture will tell us whether or not we need art for entertainment purposes or whether we need it for informational purposes, whether it's just meant to be beautiful or whether it actually has to do something. And let me explain. On these two pictures here from two different cultures, we have one on the left that's from the Egyptian Book of the Dead. And it's about communicating, good, not good wishes, but good words about this man Hunefer who died. And they're showing his body being prepared and presented to the gods as a way of sort of projecting this reality. It was a way of saying, if we paint it, it's going to come true. And this was a painting on a scroll that was done in 1275 BC. But look over on the right, that stone carving is part of a Christian church that was done, over 100 years later. And in this painting, in this sculpture, we have a religious purpose, and you have right in the middle, the Lord, and then we have people that are sinners going to a bad place, and we have people over on the right that are going to heaven. And this was right over the doorway to the church. Can you imagine what that function was? For people who were illiterate in the Middle Ages, they would go into this church and they would see, if I go in as a sinner, I'm going to come out as a saint, just like these two images were presented. That's how function works. But function also is really important when we talk about culture in this way. These pieces are all from African art history, and they also serve to tell us what art does for culture. So the mask that you see over on the left is part of a ceremony, a ritual. It's an initiation rite for young women who would, perform this ritual wearing this mask and sort of go from being a girl to a woman. In the middle, you see this Lucasa memory board. That was actually sort of like a book. And those marks on it that look kind of like stones and beads on the back of a turtle shell, they could be read by someone in the community to remember the important events just by its visual appearance. And then finally, one of my favorites over on the right is called the Nkasi Nkindi. And it was a very important function in a community. This particular one was made in the 19th or 20th century, but they had been used for centuries. And they were sort of like a visible contract between two people that had a dispute. They would go see, a magic person in the village, and he would get them to agree on something and then drive a sharp nail into this figure. And that way, anybody who could look at this figure would remember. That's sort of like our signature, right? And sometimes they would even attach pieces of hair or clothing to make it a personal connection, right? And that's how art can function, serving a very real cultural function, not just an individual one. So when we've talked about form and function, we didn't really mention architecture, but architecture definitely has to be functional, right? How does this piece, which is a house called Falling Water, it's in Pennsylvania, and it was done in the early 20th century by Frank Lloyd Wright, and it was built directly over a river. But you know what's funny about this house? it's got to serve a function. People have to live in it, but it also has to be able to stand and balance and look like it's part of the landscape. And that's really what he was going for. The cultural, idea was architecture should not stand out. It shouldn't wipe out the landscape. It should be built into the landscape. And that's how he used concrete to kind of balance. That's what those big, blocky things are, those horizontal elements. They help balance the weight, and they look almost like tree branches, don't they? So function has more than just, a cultural view. This was done for a particular family that hired him. So it was an individual value as well. So last thing, when we wrap up here today, is I want you to think about this. Do you think that artists who are integrating cultural ideas into their art, do you think they make a conscious decision to do that? Do they sit down and say, I'm going to convey my cultural heritage when I make art? What do you think? I see not always. I see sometimes. I think you're right. I think sometimes they do. If we look at these three pieces right here, you're absolutely right. I think it depends. So we see the boot mask, and this is from the Pacific Islanders. In the middle, we see this gorgeous piece. It's one of the oldest pieces in art history. It's called ambum stone, and it was sort of functional as a, ceremonial mortar for the, grinding up of things. And then you see the artibial carpet. All of those things, I think, were definitely influenced by culture in a big way. But do you think it's possible for somebody to sit down, just like we did at the start tonight, and do a quick drawing? Can you sit down and do a piece of artwork that has no cultural impact at all, even if you're not thinking about it or you're trying to make it really bland? Is that possible? I kind of agree with you there, Michael. I don't think that you can. I think that culture, like we saw at the beginning, is linked to identity. And even though I could make up a name for, and say, oh, my name is not Grace Jackson, it's something else, it's still not my true identity. I think part of who we are comes from culture. And I don't think that I don't think it's possible to look at art and not talk about the culture that is, belongs to the artist. I think you're right. Sometimes it depends whether they try to do it. Like in this case, this is an artist who's working and alive today, whose name is Ai Weiwei, and he's an activist. He is from China, and he actually was arrested by the Chinese government for speaking out against them, right? They didn't want his commentary about their government not caring for the people. And so he decided he was going to make an art exhibit. And you see what it looks like over there on the left? That's right. It's exactly right. It's sunflower seeds. And he had people in the community, where one of the poorest communities in China, he paid them to make and paint these tiny little porcelain, real actual size sunflower seeds. And he had over 100 million of them made, and he spread them out in a room, and that was his art. But it was tied to his culture in this way. China became really, lucrative in the trade market because it had porcelain that people all around Europe wanted to buy centuries ago. And yet, the other thing that China is known for is its communist government under Mao Zedong, who, always portrayed in his propaganda that he was like the sun and the Chinese people were like sunflowers. And so by using sunflower seeds, he's referencing this propaganda, this ideology from his government. And it looks so harmless, doesn't it? They just look like seeds, don't they? But I think part of when he was prompted to do this comes from who he is and where he's from. So when you talk about art, I told you at the beginning today, I wanted you to be able to feel comfortable talking about art. So I'm just going to give you a couple of quick tips because I did most of the talking about it today, but I think it's important for you to feel empowered to do it yourself. So just start with what you see. If somebody asks you, what do you think about a piece? Just tell them what you see. And as you're thinking about that, you'll start thinking, wonder why they chose to do it this way. Why did they use blue? Why didn't they use more colors? Why did they only use straight lines? Those questions that tell us what the artist did and what they didn't do will help us get to the heart of why did they do those things. So if we're talking about Ai Weiwei, we can describe the sunflower seeds, but then we go, wonder why he did sunflower seeds. And we dig a little bit deeper, and then we can find out that cultural connection that's so important when you're talking about why art is made. The other fun thing I like to do is called intersections in art. And that is where you take things that don't normally go together and you put them together. And that's another way you can analyze art. So if you were thinking about the form, content, context, or function of these pieces that are from totally different areas and time periods, you would really have a lot of fun comparing them and thinking about the cultural differences that maybe made the art different. By the way, on these slides, I'm going to ask you, which one do you prefer, the one on the right or the one on the left? What do you think? Really? That's cool. So the other thing then you can start saying to yourself is not just what was the artist trying to do, but why do I like that one? What does it make me think about? And maybe what does that tell me about who I am? Here's another intersection. Have you seen the Great Wave? That's a woodcut. Or maybe you know the famous Moai of Easter Island. It's Rapa Nui. But those huge basalt carvings, if we compare them, it really can tell us something about why they were made, but we can also talk about function for that print under the Great Wave. So which one is your favorite? The one on the left or the one on the right? I love that one too. I got one more intersection for you. I bet you weren't expecting to see that, were you? Well, part of art history isn't just the stuff that's really gorgeous, like this architectural feat that's carved into the living rock in Petra, the kingdom of the Nabateans, or this upside down urinal that was done and put in a gallery in 1917. Do you have a favorite? I would be surprised if anybody said the right one. I have some students that like it because they're like, whoa, that's so shocking and edgy. But yeah, generally what we've learned is that some of you have a taste for art that you think is maybe it needs to look a certain way. It needs to maybe contribute something or have a really obvious, form that is appealing. So I hope that as you think about art now, you're leaving here with a better understanding of how culture can impact form, content, context, and function. And I also hope that you think about not just art in art history, like from a long time ago, but art that's made today that's all around us. And not just visual art, but like music and performances and plays and things we can go see. They're part of our culture too. And sometimes I think you'll find that by embracing this art culture that we have around us, it can really improve your quality of life. That's what I believe anyway. So I want to know, do you have any questions for me that, or just any thoughts about how culture impacts art? Any closing ideas or questions? It's been really fun for me to interact with y'all in the chat. I didn't think anybody would ask a question, so I'll give you one more. Instead of asking a question, if you don't have one, tell me one thing that you're taking away from today that you didn't know before you came in. Just one thing. That's perfect. I think that's right. It's not just what you see. What else are you leaving here with? Is there any one type of form or function, context or content that's most interesting to you? When you look at art, what's the first thing you see? Maybe now you can pick something you wouldn't necessarily go to. Yeah, I think that's what, well, that's my point. I'm glad that you buy into that idea. Well, thank you all for being here tonight. And I hope that you enjoyed talking about art and culture. I've loved seeing your comments in the chat, and I thank you for joining tonight. Thanks, Michael. I appreciate it. Have a good night. Thank you, Shruti. Bye.